Please give a warm welcome back to Robinhood CEO Wes Moore. Joining him on stage is Jim Shelton, partner Amandla Enterprises and entrepreneur in residence at Blue Merid.
Good afternoon. I went and dug in the chair, so I'm just going to stay right here. How's everybody doing? Good? Yeah. Great day, guys. And this has been a day full of highlights. And I am excited to introduce one last one. Jim Shelton is not only our former Deputy Secretary of Education, one of the most innovative education and societal innovators that we have within our society right now. He's also a friend and a mentor, and I just can't thank him enough for your leadership and for being here today. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Totally my honor to be here. You know, introductions are funny things because people are always inclined to use superlatives, and I appreciate them all. But after hearing the data and just living life, I think the most important introduction is just to keep saying, I am just an average man who's had extraordinary opportunity. And if we keep saying that about ourselves, then I think we'll be able to look at other people in very different ways. So thank you much, Wes. I really appreciate it.
Well, but also, you're a man who's actually devoted his life to making sure that we provide real opportunity to people. And it brings me to the first thing I want to be able to discuss with you. Out of the multitude of different facets of our society, of this conversation that you could be a part of, that you could lead on, the one you are zeroing in right now is on this conversation on mobility. Sure. And real sustainable mobility for people. Why was that the focus area that you wanted to drill down on?
So it's really interesting. When you mentioned I was Deputy Secretary of Education. When I left the administration, I had done a bunch of work. I had done the core work of the Department of Education, but I also had the opportunity through the Department of Education to work on something called Promised Neighborhoods, which looked very specifically at the question of place and at this notion of a cradle to career pathway. In the process of doing that, wound up running across this thing called the Social Genome Project. And if you haven't heard of it, you should check it out. It is a longitudinal model built off of people's life trajectories. And from that, they actually were, the question I asked is, they were trying to figure out how you actually use a model to predict, if you do a specific intervention, can you actually change somebody's path and how much does it change it? My question was, if you are agnostic to the intervention and just say, what points matter most in people's lives to actually put them on the path to a thriving adulthood, what happens? And the reality is this. Every point matters along the way. There's some that are really identifiable, you know. Being born to parents who actually plan to have you. Being ready for school. All the things we would naturally predict. But at the same time, the reality is when you look at the numbers, millions of Americans aren't making it across those thresholds. And because they don't, what we heard earlier is what happens. The poverty numbers, despite our great conversations, despite the fact that the war on poverty started 50-some years ago, the numbers are barely changing. So if we want it to actually change, if we actually want to do something about poverty, then you have to move people up. And the only way you move people up is to begin to figure out what keeps them from doing that and what's most important along the way. And then once you begin to figure out that those things are there, then you say, is there something to be done? Like, do we know anything about what to do about these different milestones? And if there are impediments, do we know anything about how to eliminate these impediments or at least help people recover from the impediments? And the good news is the answer is yes, we actually know a lot. There are, as people said throughout the day, there are things that actually work. I was really struck by this last panel about this tension that we seem to have about, is it this or is it that? Can I just say my insight for the day is, and both. Like, and both. Every movement we have ever had has been driven by anger. There is a villain. There is something to march against. But it has to be matched with hope that there is something to do on the other side that actually can change things. We, in this circumstance, have both. We should be mad as heck about the way the world operates right now. We should be especially mad because it's operated this way for a long time, and it seems like people are trying to make it worse. At the same time, we should be totally empowered by the fact that there are many, many things to be done. And that, like being able to do something, not just see the problem and admire it, that has me focused very squarely on this issue.
And you've had a chance to see it, though, whether it's from the perspective of government, whether it's perspective of philanthropy, whether as an entrepreneur. When you say there are things that you have seen that are really giving you hope, and you've watched this kind of cross-pollination of progress, what exactly does that mean, and what exactly does that look like? How should we be thinking about this work to be able to create exactly what you're envisioning?
So let's just talk about the things that even we've just heard about today, right? At different points during the day, you heard about solutions that were developed in the Bronx. You heard about folks who have been able to do narrative change. You've heard about an intervention that a tech company made that shifted racial bias by 75%. You heard about the reduction in homicide and use of guns by 40 and 30% respectively in a city that people would have written off. Like, if those kinds of interventions don't give you hope, if you don't believe that if you could do it in that one place that we could be doing it in others, then you're in the wrong room, right? And so I don't have to go far. I can find lots and lots of examples all across the country of these kind of things, but every room I walk into, I find an example of something that is working that frankly we're not doing someplace else. And that's unfortunately been true whether it's walking into one school building just trying to get it to go down the hall to another classroom, or a school system to another school system, or a state to a state, or a city to a city. It doesn't matter. We are terrible at identifying what works, identifying how to adapt it and scale it to other places, and then sustaining it with the kind of policies and funding that are needed to actually ensure that it gets to everyone who needs it. And that is the work that we have to be on.
And it seems like another thing that we're terrible at is patience, right? And patience, and patience in some ways it's a good way, right? We want to be able to lead with urgency. We want to be able to lead with an idea that we got to get this done now. But we also understand that particularly when you're talking about something as complex as mobility, the answers might not be there tomorrow. And they might not be there next week. So how do we then balance that idea of having a sense of urgency, but knowing that there are going to be certain things that are going to take a little longer to show themselves?
Yeah, you know, whenever you start trying to do something new, you create a PowerPoint. My first slide in every PowerPoint, it's just true, right? You guys try and explain yourself to people. And the first slide in my PowerPoint now is always this quote from Einstein. It says, "Everything should be made as simple as it can be, but no simpler." If we think that a single silver bullet, one solution, overnight solution is going to solve something as hard as this problem, we need to stay home. It's just not going to happen. And I want to say, especially to my colleagues in philanthropy, especially those who have worked for people who've made their fortunes in, say, developing products, there's no one product that's going to do this. And so we have to recognize that complex problems will require complex solutions. We should make them as simple as possible so they can be replicated. But they're not going to be that simple, and they're not going to happen overnight. And especially when you start talking about needing to change, we've been saying narrative change, but we're talking about changing people's belief systems. Yes. That is not going to happen overnight. We heard the example of, LGBTQ rights. That was a decades-long effort. Decades-long. And still, right? And so we have to, I used to draw these things to confuse everybody in the room, these little funny little arcs, like one short arc, one next longer arc, one really long arc, about these arcs of change that we need to be on. And we need to do the things that we can do today, especially where they can actually deliver opportunities for people to see it's actually possible, because we need that as human beings. Like, we need the countervailing facts to keep stacking up to knock us off the narrative that we have. But the reality is that there's only so many things that are going to happen in that relative, call it 3 to 5 year window, where we really want to see things happen. There's another window of 5 to 10 years out, which is probably going to mean reinventing some things, or even just taking some of the things that we really know to full scale. And then there's the really hard stuff where we have no idea and or requires us to change culturally in order for it to happen. And that's a much longer arc. Call it a 25-year arc. And we have to have the patience for it, but most importantly, we have to look at that 25-year arc and say, what needs to happen today? And then as someone said earlier, what are we willing to do today to make sure that 25 years from now, that thing that is supposed to happen for our wildest ambitions to be realized actually happens. There's a guy named Alan Kay, who's like this luminary in the computer science field. And somehow I wound up picking him up as a mentor. And I still remember this one thing he said to me. He said, the first thing you have to remember is that 40 years ago, 40 years from now is today. Right? And so if we just remember that, yes, if we start 40 years from now, in some of our lifetime, things could be entirely different. Entirely different. And that ought to give us patience.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work of Amandla and the work with Blue Meridian?
Sure. So for those, I'll tell you a slightly longer story as if I was succinct before. So right after graduate school, I wound up going to work in South Africa to work on voting rights. And I was doing voter education, and then I wound up trying to go into communities to, with Native South Africans to teach. And I wound up at these political rallies. And for those who don't know, there was a popular chant at the time, and the person who would speak would say, Amandla. And then the people would say, Awetu, or Ngwetu, depending on where you were. And for those who don't know, Amandla means power, and Awetu means to the people. So the company I created to house my work, whatever it winds up being, is Amandla Enterprises. It is the notion of how do we actually give people power, with power having a very specific definition, which is the ability to create, limit, or make decisions for oneself or others. And how do we create enterprises that give people the power to do great things and good things in the world? Now, here's how that relates to what I'm doing with Blue Meridian. I'm right now an entrepreneur in residence with Blue Meridian. For those who don't know, Blue Meridian was founded on the back of the Edmund McConnell Clark Foundation when they decided to spend down their resources. And what they thought is they wanted to make bigger bets on things that actually work, because there are solutions in the world that work. And what they thought is, if we actually work together, if many philanthropists aggregate their funding, you can make many smarter, bigger bets together. And they started to do that work and have been doing it now for a number of years. In fact, they deployed and actually aggregated over about $1.5 billion and then been able to commit to many organizations tens of millions of dollars to actually take their work to scale. And the question is, okay, so if you believe that as philanthropists, as the public sector, we can actually begin as the tip of the spear of universal change, because you still need the public sector, to drive this innovation work to a level of scale that it then becomes apparent and makes the case for the public sector. How then do you think very differently about bringing in the public sector earlier, bringing in the political conversation, driving the narrative change that drives those arcs over the 5, 10, and 25 years that we need to actually crack the back of these systemic problems that have plagued us for a long time? So what I'm doing with Blue Meridian is saying, okay, they have done a fantastic job of identifying solutions that actually work and driving them to scale. But what are the other things that you need to do if you're going to crack the back of the systemic issue? And how do you create an investment strategy around that? And can you actually raise capital to do it in a way that takes us from making $500,000 very nice and helpful grants to investing at the kind of scale that you do when you want to change an entire enterprise? And by enterprise, I mean the way our systems work to keep people in poverty today.
And when you're talking about bringing in the public sector earlier,
sure.
What exactly does that mean?
It means I'm going to speak with a certainty I don't have yet, but I'll just say it this way. The first thing is that very quickly, when you realize you want to attack one of these problems, the first thing you realize is that we are not good at two things in the public sector right now. I'll say this as a person on the other side from the public sector. The first thing is we as human beings, people don't like to talk about it this way, but we do. We'd like to do the things that are easier, and we also do the things that are rewarding. And so when we set up public systems that actually people still respond to them. Let me give you an example. Higher education. So in higher education, we should be rightfully proud of what we created in terms of a system that creates and has created incredible opportunity. It's one of the best, still considered one of the best in the world. And it provides incredible financial aid and all that great stuff. What did we miss? What do we miss when we set up our higher education system and the public systems that create the incentive systems around it? Graduation. Graduation. We created an entire system that rewards people for getting people, more and more people, into post-secondary education with nothing on the other side that says you have to get them out and into something that's going to help them on the other side. And so what do we have? Many, many good actors who follow their mission and have done fantastic work getting people opportunity. One of the best things we've ever done. What also did we have? A set of folks who were bad actors, who realized that you could make a lot of money just by getting people in, whether they finished or not, whether they left with a lot of debt or not, whether they ever got a job or not. And so our system has created both of those worlds. Now, could we have guessed that that would happen? Actually, probably, yeah. Easy for me to say on this side of it, but we have to start looking at our systems and the incentives they create, not through rose-colored glasses, but what really will happen. And so we need to look at that incentive system. The second thing is we have to recognize that our systems don't change very quickly. And so how do we actually get in the business of having the public sector look for innovations that it can then vet to prove that they deserve to be scaled in a way that serves everyone's needs. I got a lot of credit for being innovative. People use that word around me a lot for this program I ran called the Invest in Innovation Fund at the Department of Education. What people don't know is its original name was the What Works and Innovation Fund. And the idea that was the real innovation, I want you to pay really close attention here. If you had a little bit of evidence, you got a little bit of money. If you had a lot of evidence, you got a lot of money. That was the big deal. Right? Now think about that, though. That is not how most of our programs work. Right? It's not how most of our programs work. That innovation pipeline does not really work in the public sector right now. We aren't set up. I took over the Office of Innovation at the Department of Education. It ran about 75% of the competitive programs at the department. Less than 3% of the programs had been fully evaluated at the project level within the last decade. Now think about that. This is the program that's supposed to produce most of the demonstrations, like what we're supposed to learn from, and yet they hadn't been evaluated to know whether the things were actually, which ones work better than the others. So we have to create public systems that are in the business of finding things that work, finding things that look promising, and then building the evidence base to actually decide whether they deserve large amounts of public funding to go to scale. That's the kind of thing.
And I think, right? Because in some cases, it is a question of if this could get public funding, it could help to accelerate our drive to be able to solve the problem we're trying to fix. And in some cases, that's actually not the issue. How do we then go through the process of, particularly early stage, thinking about that and think about those gating criteria, those gating questions in the way that we want to try to answer the larger problem?
So this is one of the things that, if I understand the question correctly, this is one of the things that was powerful for me about finding that model. Like, how many of you in here are parents? Okay. How many of you are now parents of adults? Okay. At what point along the way did you stop? Right? Like, this notion of the cradle into career and then some is something that we all intuitively know when it comes to our own children. And yet, when we look at interventions, we look at them in these isolated ways. One thing that used to drive me crazy is a person who loves evidence, loves studies, all the rigor, but like when people jump on the Head Start studies and say, oh, fade-out effect. Again, to the parents, which one of you thought you were done when you found a great preschool? Right? So we have to be able to see how each of these things fits into a system that propels, like I said, millions more people towards thriving adulthood. Yes. How do they connect? And then most importantly, how do you connect them? Right? Because if we keep doing this thing where there's one really successful program over here and a kid goes through it and then they drop into an abyss, and then there's another really good system over here and some other kids get that and then they drop into an abyss, we are never going to get there. And so the power of what I heard today, several things. One, we all know, but the data makes it really clear, this is like it all, I can talk national, it all comes down to place. Whether you're talking about regions across the country, like the Southeast is very different than the Midwest. Whether you're talking about within a city, whether you're talking about within a neighborhood, the adaptations that we need to put in place to have it work are clear because the context is different in each of those places. But the developmental needs of kids from birth all the way through don't change. The only question is, are they getting them? Are they able to get them at home? Are they able to get them at school? If they aren't able to get them there, how do we actually weave together the systems at the proper level of intensity for them to get what they need to thrive? And we don't ask those questions in that way, and we definitely aren't doing it in a way that is actually efficient, so that given constrained resources, I say that to my fellow progressives in the room, given constrained resources, we can make the best decisions about allocation of resources, right? So the thing I love about evidence-based programs is it is a social justice approach. Like, a lot of the folks on the conservative side like it because they say, oh, good use of government funds. There should be no one more concerned in good use of government funds than somebody who believes they're progressive. Because we know there's only so much to go around. Yes. We cannot afford a penny to be wasted on things that aren't going to work. We can't afford to be serving people in ways that actually duplicate other services they're receiving. So every time we make a better decision about allocating resources, we are making a more just system. We are creating the opportunity for more people to make it. We are not organized that way right now. And frankly, oftentimes we don't even think about it that way right now. And I think we have to if we're going to crack the back of this problem.
As we are getting into, well, it seems like there's a never-ending campaign. But we're now getting into 2019, so a year away from when we're having another presidential election. We're having a lot of people now who are all talking about what they would do if they were to take on the seat. What are you, without even giving a name, what are you hoping to hear from the potential people who are looking at running? What are you hoping to hear when they're talking about these issues about poverty? What are you hoping to hear when we're talking about issues of economic mobility?
So I'll tell you, the first thing I'm looking to hear, especially around poverty and economic mobility, and I think you heard it from the panelists before, is the conjoining of the issue. Like, for the first time, we actually recognize that this is not a black-brown issue, that the American dream, as you saw in the very first charts from Raj Chetty, has been fading since the 1950s. The promise that anybody in America could do better than their parents has been getting smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And it is a critical point now where, in fact, the basic promise of America is to the point where we've got a 50-50 shot of whether you can actually achieve what was considered the American dream. Like, forget the absolute truth of that. Think about what that does to a national psyche. Like, people talk about the greatest generation. The greatest generation had reason to believe at 90% levels that they would do better than their parents. And now this past generation had a 50-50 chance. Think about that in the national psyche. That means we're all in this. We are all in this together. And the things that allow us to succeed and the things that keep us from succeeding, whether it be impacted by the criminal justice system, drug addiction, mental health issues, whatever those things are, they impact all of us. And it turns out, black and brown people are the canaries in the mine. I hate to say it, but we are. If it happens to us, you better believe, I don't care who you are, it's coming. It's coming. And so you better figure out how to help us address it now, because it's coming for you and yours. And I think that if someone can tell that story in a way that has us question our own belief systems, so that we then begin to say, yes, if we want to be the America that we said we did, right? And there's a reason that people want to harken back to America the Great. Like, those ideals, the justice for all, the equality for all, the land of opportunity, like, those are great ideals. We just have to recognize that it has been built since the beginning on a system that also reflects all the other things that we talked about today. The bias, the beliefs, the hierarchy about valuing people. And that if we're going to go after this thing, we have to both recognize the inherent value in every person, recognize the things that get in people's way, and recognize that the only way we're going to solve this is we actually figure out how to do it together. So I'm looking for that from people. And then the second thing I'm looking for is realistic solution sets. And what I mean by that is, from the left, I need a recognition of constraints. I need people to say, look, there are some things we can do and some things we can't do. And yes, recognizing with all the resources in the world we could do certain things, there are some things we don't have the resources for right now. And especially after someone who's been running up trillion-dollar debts every single year of being in office. On the right, I need them to say, stop doing this thing about something for nothing government. Right? That somehow we expect to be the best country in the world, the most competitive country in the world, to have opportunity for everyone, to have great education systems, and we don't want to pay any taxes for it. I need people to come together and say, if we're going to get there from here, here's what we need to do together. Here are the hard decisions that we have to make. Here are the things that we know that works. Here are the kind of systems we can put in place to actually learn more about what works much more quickly. And that's what I want to hear from any of these candidates. And I want to hear a message of, let's do it together. Can I say one thing I want to hear much more from people like us going into this? I don't know how you all heard like Jennifer Everhart or any of the other parts. Here's how I hear it. We're all freaking racists. Like, a lot of people hear that stuff and they think about those other people and what they believe and how they manifested in the way they will move about in the world. If you heard that and you think that was about somebody else, I would just ask you to go home and think again. Like, the reality is, did anybody see the study where they figured out that it is actually people who identify as liberal who, when communicating with African American whites, who consider themselves liberal when they communicate with African Americans, speak in a condescending way. They lower the level of language that they use, et cetera. If you label yourself conservative, you don't actually do that. Think about it. Think about it. So I want us to recognize that these issues that we think are about the other, they're us. And that if we don't bring that lens, that discipline of questioning the way we operate in the world, and even the solutions that we craft, to the conversation when we are in a position to inform people's policies, how they set up their programs, what help we think people's need, how much we let their voice actually shape the solution set, we are just as guilty as the folks that we would point at that wind up in yearbooks with their faces painted black. In fact, I would say we're more dangerous because day-to-day decisions, we make a lot more of them. Sorry.
No. And I went to a minute, that's right. Well, let me ask, so I want to open it up to the group, but I did have one more question before. In fact, but this one's going to involve y'all. So in the past 9 months, raise your hand if you've been to a conference. A conference, any conference. All right. In the past 9 months, raise your hand if the things that you learned at that conference or did at that conference or studied at that conference, that you actualized something from that conference afterwards. So far few hands. How can we make this conference different than the 8% of hands that I saw still up?
So I'll say 3 things really quickly. One, I think that like you guys brought it today in terms of the power of the people who are presenting. I think that the manifestation of the things that we know today, and the tools that we have available to us that we didn't have available to us before. I don't know how many of you are thinking about and using the Opportunity Atlas. I don't know how many of you have ever taken the kind of data that Jennifer Eberhardt has into the conversations that you have about implicit bias. But that set of knowledge, tools, and resources, if we're not figuring out how to deploy them in ways that make us more impactful, shame on us.
Yes.
The second thing I would say is you curated a room across sectors. And by definition, there is an opportunity for us to figure out how we get much more leverage out of each other. And part of my what do we all, like I often say, like, our first definition of brilliance is that we agree, right? So I think your day was brilliant, right? But this notion that if we are going to be successful, we have to find a way to work across sectors. that we have to find ways for business to do what it does well, for the nonprofit sector to do what it does well, for our policy people and our political people to figure out how we actually combine our efforts and our resources to take these things to the next level of impact, next level of scale, next level of sustainability. If we can figure out how to weave that together so we're not so fragmented, we'll have a much greater likelihood of success. And what I'll say on that one is the third thing is start. And so like tomorrow, you and I are getting together specifically to talk about like how do we actually bring together folks who are in the business of aggregating capital to try and drive this kind of work, right? You met somebody today who you know could be helpful. You have their card in your hand, you took the trouble to get it. Friggin' use it. Like, use it. Not to just send the note or connect on LinkedIn, but go, okay, what's that thing we're gonna do this quarter that's gonna actually change somebody's life or change a policy or create an opportunity? Like, that's how things will be different. I am guilty as anyone, like with the stack of cards that I got from conferences over the last 9 months, some of which I reached out to, many of which I didn't. But what can be different this time is a concerted effort to actually make something happen around a framework that I think that has been made out that's pretty dang clear about ways we can work together. And I just hope that like this is different in that way, and I know you're going to drive it to be so.
Great. Questions? Do we have time for one question? Yes, sorry.
Hi.
Oh.
Wait, you got the mic in the back, so we're going to do two.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we'll do two quick questions. Sorry. Yes.
Okay. Hi, thank you. My name is Geoff Ginsburg. I'm a CEO of a Robin Hood partner, East Harlem Scholars Academies, and we do after-school programs, teacher training, other things. And I just want to get some help from you all connecting the dots. I'm thinking about two things. One, social, emotional learning, and I'm also thinking about history. And Van Jones wasn't joking, but sort of made a passing comment of like, haven't they picked up a history book? And I thought about a lot of the students that I work with in our after-school program who go to the New York City school system, who actually by senior year you can get a degree, the graduation you talk about, absolutely not really knowing any U.S. history and not having actually gotten the chance and opportunity to study a lot of that history and think about their own lives within that history in the future. And I think about social emotional learning, and actually, I don't know if he's still here, but John King's group, Education Trust, who we read a lot, just put out something about social emotional learning and counselors. And there's not a lot of incentives in the system to even have counselors, and there are very few counselors in schools. We don't even have basic conversations about social emotional learning, which again, can contribute to what we call we run what we call an anti-racist education network, and it really contributes having those two factors. And so it's really hard to do those things. So when I think about scalability, it's a big challenge. Raj Chetty was nice enough to do a smaller little Q&A group right after that sort of formed ad hoc out there. And there happened to be some education folks in the room, or anyone was there. And someone asked him about teachers, and he said, well, we took a look at that, and we felt like we couldn't, within a sort of reasonable time frame, like make a difference. It's too hard. like you literally saw the data and said, like, it's too hard to move on in terms of like getting better quality teaching. It's too hard to measure, it's too hard to move the way the structures are set up. So thinking about action, thinking about the conference that makes action, I wonder just where you see those things, like the examples of, say, teaching history or having social emotional learning in schools, and having schools that can push it up against racism and think about identities differently within the education system. How do we structurally change that?
So one, you asked a giant question, but let me try and take it from a couple of perspectives. The first thing is that, John's still here, and his group and the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, like the scientific consensus is very clear now that we keep trying to act as though our education system, is built around these academic things, and somehow that is detached from these other things around the social and emotional and other elements of a whole child's development. And that includes their mental health, their physical health, but what I want to talk about very specifically is also their identity. And the reason I want to talk about that is I want us to think about everything that we heard today about the context in which our young people grow. And the science is very clear that everybody basically starts with the same machinery. Genes are a chemical follower to context. And that once you are exposed to a certain context, it changes how all your learning happens and all of your reactions. Now think about what we heard today about the environments in which young people find themselves. Not only like what we heard about poverty, but also what signals people send them every day about who they are, right? Every day, someone sends you a signal about who you are and what they expect from you, even people who think that they care about you. And they have to build the resilience and persistence to see themselves in a way that allows them, regardless of what feedback they're getting, to strive for something better if we hope for them to escape the context in which they find themselves in today. So we cannot engage in this conversation about economic and social mobility without addressing head-on this question of social and emotional and identity development so that our young people, and I will say very specifically, when you look at that data that Raj presented on black males, the thing he did not say is it doesn't matter, like you can control for anything you want, high school completion, college completion, et cetera, the disparity is not explained by that. It's explained by something else, hard to name. But that means you are living in an environment that requires you to find your way, to navigate or fight your way through it. And if we don't find a way to teach people to do that, we also will fail. So I said a lot of words to say it's got to be built in. We have to recognize our school environments have to foster and support these things. Those school systems are not going to be enough. Asking schools and education systems alone to carry that burden is too much. But we are really bad at figuring out how you actually weave those systems together. Community schools are beginning, but they also are not enough. So the work now is to figure out how we weave together the collection of systems and supports both public and private, non-government, community-based organizations and home in a way that actually meets all of our young people's needs, and that's a lot.
And that idea of teaching history, culture, and identity could not be emphasized. That is such an important point because, frankly, we have a lot of our young kids, and Jim's exactly right, particularly when you're talking about boys of color, African-American boys, who are oftentimes coming up, and if you don't know your own history, if you don't know from where you come from and the richness of your own history, and you're allowing for other people to interpret what that is, oftentimes you, as Booker T. Washington once said, you know, if you break a man's spirit, you do not need to escort him to the back door because he will walk there himself. Our ability to teach the true history, the true culture, matters to our kids, and that they have that, and they're actually being emboldened by it. I have to apologize because I am told we are now hitting a witching hour.
I guess I should apologize.
No, you do not have to apologize at all. This is on me, sir. This is on me. But I do want to take a moment just to very quickly and enthusiastically thank Sheldon Danziger, Dr. Marta Tienda, Raj Chetty, Daniel Lurie, Rachel Monroe, Nisha Patel, Jeff Canada, Jane Wolfogel, Sarah Altmans, Carolyn English, Alonzo James, Kaya Henderson, Nick Kristoff, Katie Couric, John King, Judith Yohannes, Catherine O'Regan, Mayor Michael Tubbs, Steve Stout, Jennifer Eberhardt, Heather McGee, Soledad O'Brien, John Ridley, Rashad Robinson, Van Jones, and my friend Jim Shelton. What an amazing day. And I also want to take a moment to thank the remarkable Robin Hood team that pulled all this together. Special shout out to our new head of partnerships and impact, Sam Tweedy, who pulled the entire agenda and items together. And a special thank you to all of you. You took time out of very busy days, very busy schedules, and frankly, for each and every one of our organizations, a chaotic and hectic time. And you came time to partnership. You came and took time out to fellowship. You came time out to spend time together and get to know each other. And we're excited about not just what today brought, but we are truly excited about what tomorrow will bring. For those who are interested and have time, we do have refreshments out here, so enjoy some food and libations. And thank you for all you do for the communities that we all love and serve. Bless you guys, and thank you so much.